Many of the children of Abbeville, Alabama, have felt that prickle on the back of their neck. That telltale sign that someone is watching them as they walk home at dusk. For parents, wanting their children to hurry home when the streetlights came on, the legend of Huggin Molly was a big help. For children, she was pretty frightening. Generations of Abbeville children have listened wide-eyed to their parents telling the story of Huggin Molly, a 7-foot-tall woman that threatens to crush you to death with her embrace. I'm Ashley McLaughlin, and I'm going to tell you a ghost story. This is Southern Haunts. "12 miles from the rolling waters of the Chattahoochee River lies the little southeast Alabama town of Abbeville, where the citizens have been telling the story of a ghost they call Huggin Molly for hundreds of years. And although the origins are unclear, it is a story that has been passed down through generations. The story claims a phantom woman would appear to children, but only at night. And I think it has to be rainy and very dark for her to show up. I'm pretty sure fog is also involved. She would find these kids on their way home and chase them down. Once caught, she would squeeze them tightly with a lung-crushing hug, and then scream in their ear. Rude, right? She never harmed them too bad, really, other than perhaps causing some ringing in their ears and years of trauma. This woman was described as being as much as 7 feet tall, wearing dark clothing and a wide-brim hat that was said to be, quote, wider than a cotton bale. For reference, I googled how wide is a cotton bale, and they are about 20 to 25 inches wide. Like many Southern ghost stories, there are several versions of the legend of Huggin Molly. The most prominent version of this story claims Molly was the ghost of a woman who had lost her newborn baby under tragic circumstances. Apparently, this woman's ghost dealt with the tragedy by hugging local children. The young mother's story begins shortly before the turn of the century. This young woman of Abbeville became pregnant out of wedlock, and in those times, this was a circumstance forgivable only by God, and slowly, if ever, forgiven by her peers and citizens of the small southern town. The father of the baby was the son of a prominent businessman in town, and he was reluctant to help with the young woman once she confronted him. The mother gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, but died a few days later. The doctor who attended her at birth and shortly afterward at her death found upon autopsy that the young mother had been poisoned. And fortunately, after investigation, the father of the baby was actually arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. Rumors around Abbeville swirled at that time and suggested that he also tried to get the mother to nurse the baby, but she refused, realizing that she had consumed the poison. The young man was convicted of the crime and sentenced to hang, but he escaped and fled Abbeville for Texas, a place where at the time, one could simply disappear. The baby grew up, and according to local accounts, was often seen lying across his mother's grave crying for her. The town's old-timers say he lived a sad and short life. Many years later, a man would take up the role of Huggin Molly. At the old Southeast Alabama Agricultural College, which is now Abbeville High School, students at the state's first free secondary school came to live in Abbeville while they attended the school. The out-of-town students boarded with the Abbeville families during the school term and would wander the streets at night, hanging out and doing what teenagers do. A professor who was rumored to be 7 feet tall grew tired of the students' revelry and believed they should remain home in their house at night. To scare them, he would don a black dress and wide-brimmed hat and set out in search of unsuspecting young students to torment. Seems like a really nice guy. The oldest account I could find of someone having an actual encounter with Huggin Molly was an account given by Mac Gregory, who was born in 1901 and owned Abbeville's Lawson Gregory grocery store for over 60 years. He described a meeting of sorts with the infamous Molly as a teenager. After delivering groceries for the store on a Saturday night, he trudged toward his home on East Washington Street. Darkness had descended upon the town, and in those days there were no lights on the tree-lined side streets. Soon fog rolled in, and he found he could barely see the path ahead. He heard footsteps and realized that someone was following behind him in the mist. When he turned around, he could just make out a large, black-robed shape about 10 yards behind him. The form appeared to be keeping pace with his steps, so he immediately began walking faster. After just a few hurried steps, Gregory realized the figure in black also walked faster, quickly closing the gap between them. Gregory, afraid and anxious, slowed his steps to see what his pursuer would do. The man or woman following, who he now believed to be Huggin Molly, adjusted their gait to that of Gregory's. The frightened teenager, afraid to run for fear the large hooded figure could easily catch up to him, kept a fast pace toward his house, now less than a city block away. When young Mac got close enough to see the steps of his home, he broke into a run and jumped onto the welcoming sanctuary of his front porch. The unlocked door opened easily in his shaking hands, and he escaped into the safety and security of his home. Mac never saw the figure again, but he made sure after that, however, to complete future grocery deliveries in Abbeville well before dark. A similar story told by Marianne Glover Leonard, a native Abbeville resident, suggested that Huggin Molly also struck fear into the hearts of the town's adults. She recounts a story about their neighbor, Dr. James Shell, who practiced medicine at the Shell Clinic in Abbeville. Walking to his home on the corner of Elm and Clenenden Streets, Dr. Shell discovered that, like Mac Gregory, a large, black-robed, hooded figure was following him. The young doctor was terrified, and he too began running when he was within about 100 yards from his home. For some reason, probably a wife's intuition, Mrs. Shell, somehow sensing the danger her husband was experiencing, was standing in her open front doorway as James rounded the corner near the cemetery on Elm Street. She held the door open as the frightened doctor dashed inside. Before shutting the door, Mrs. Shell caught a glimpse of the hooded figure waiting at the end of the drive. During the 1950s and 1960s, various Abbeville citizens shared similar tales, all passed down from parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had in one way or another encountered Huggin Molly and lived to tell about it. Due to the nature of oral tradition, it is likely that the present-day stories of Abbeville's Huggin Molly are partly fact and partly a product of an old southern town with a few imaginative storytellers. No one seems to have a clear answer as to this individual's identity, and even less information exists as to why he or she chose to don a hooded black robe and frighten the children and teenagers of this small town. One thing that seems certain, however, is that many years ago, a black-robed person roamed the streets of Abbeville, and its citizens seemed to believe that she or he was the ghost of a human who appeared to enjoy frightening the people of the town. And although there are no casualties associated with Huggin Molly, she still seems pretty creepy. Today, the telling of Huggin Molly continues to evoke reminiscence among the townspeople because this unforgettable tale remains firmly etched in their memories, and the town itself has fully embraced the legend. There is even a restaurant bearing the name Huggin Molly, owned by Yellowwood president and CEO Jimmy Rain. Yeah, the lumber company with the silly commercials and yellow tags. It's based out of Abbeville. There are menu items such as Molly burgers and comeback sauce. An advertisement for Abbeville's Huggin Molly restaurant on the official website of the Alabama Tourism Department carries the following advertisement. Quote, generations of Abbeville children have listened wide-eyed to their parents tell the story of Huggin Molly. They have hurried home on nights lit only by the moon's glow, certain they saw something in the shadows, afraid she would be around the next corner. Legend says if she happens upon you, she chases you down, gives you a huge hug, and screams in your ear. Now Huggin Molly has returned to the streets of Abbeville in the shape of a 1950s-style restaurant with an authentic soda fountain, serving specialty sandwiches, that's WITCHES, at lunch, and offering fine dining at dinner. Huggin Molly's is a family restaurant serving friendly hugs and good food. Perhaps the most interesting account of Huggin Molly appeared in Legends, Lore, and True Tales of the Chattahoochee by Michelle Smith. According to Smith, Molly was a real person, a child, in fact, that grew up in Abbeville. Molly lost her arm for an unstated reason and was given a golden arm to replace it. The story goes that as Molly grew older, several men in town were waiting for her to die so they could steal her golden arm. I had a hard time finding specifics about her death, but the book claims that once she died, some horrible men in town dug her up and stole her arm. As the men began filling the grave back up with dirt, a voice rose from the tattered coffin. I want my golden arm. Upon hearing the voice, the men dropped their tools and ran as quickly as they could. It was not fast enough. During the chase, one of the men was said to have been grabbed by a figure wearing a black robe. She squeezed him hard, cutting off his air supply as she screamed in his ears. The other men fought to free their friend from the hooded figure. Finally breaking free from her grip, the men escaped the cemetery with the golden arm. Later, the men melted down Molly's golden arm into pieces and sold it. It is said her ghost now roams the streets of Abbeville, snatching children in search of her golden arm. Regardless of where the real tale began, most of the citizens agree the lore is based in fact. So if you ever catch yourself down in Abbeville, Alabama, just try to stay inside after dark, or Huggin Molly's gonna get ya. Hi there, it's your host, Ashley McLaughlin. I just wanted to take a moment and thank you for tuning in to Southern Haunts. And if you like what you hear, feel free to leave a review and subscribe to the podcast to make it easier for others who like to hear haunty, spooky stuff too. Thanks. Bye.